Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's show is going to focus on government investments and divestments in Rwanda and what this means for Rwanda's economic outlook. We'll take a look at whether government investments in the last 10 years have paid off. I'll also look for the reasons of government divestiture from private companies, from private enterprises. My name is Dana, I'm the host of The Square, and joining us on this very interesting topic is Jack Kayonga. Jack is the CEO of the Agaciro Development Fund. Jack, thank you for honoring our invitation.
Thank you for inviting us.
As always, The Square is made up by three other resident panelists. I'll start with Charles Harbour on my right. Charles, good to have you.
Same here, Dana. How are you?
Good, after 2 weeks.
Yes, 2 weeks in absentia. I felt like a whole year.
Berna, always great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dan.
And Ephraim, great to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
As we always do on The Square, before we dive into today's topic, we'll just have a quick midweek recap. I'll start with you, Charles.
Well, the weekend and slightly before the weekend into Monday, my phone and all my social media feeds were packed with a very enterprising lady called Isimbi Noella. She's Noeline, thank you. I'm glad you know of her and you even know her names better than I do.
Of course.
But what intrigued me most was the reaction behind. She went out there. Probably the pictures she posted may have come off as indecent to certain people, probably even including myself. But my biggest issue was really around the reaction. We need to. It's high time we drew a line between showbiz and contemporary culture. It's high time we drew a very, very clear line between art and culture. We can give a million examples until the cows come home. People who say that girls should not be going out dancing because it is against our culture. So I think my biggest issue was really around the reaction that we gave it, and considering, this lady, she's got an interesting story, a moving story. She did not qualify to go into the finals of the Miss Rwanda pageant. And she makes news, so whatever she does is bound to make news. If we ridicule her, which very big quarters of the Rwandan population did, there's probably a modeling agency out there or a fashion house out there that's going to be very happy to snap her. So I think that caught my eye.
Yeah, I think it caught everyone's eye, and the ensuing sort of solidarity tweets that followed with her pictures. Very interesting. Brenna, Ephraim, quick midweek recap.
Just to add on what he mentioned, one, I feel that when we talk about the creative industry, people don't really have an understanding of what it is, or perhaps have a specific view of creativity. Yet, creativity has no boundaries. If you to really build an industry around creativity, then you cannot control it. That's one. Two, I think most of us speak from a place of privilege. When you're privileged, most of the things, you see them and you don't understand them. So I think it is important that most of the time we take a step backwards and understand that we are speaking from a place of privilege. Fast forward, the CEO Forum was quite interesting. The organization was superb. Well done to RDB, the Rwanda Convention Bureau, because they've really done all the heavy lifting. It's not easy to get CEOs to come to Africa, from around the world. So it's a big statement when you see these people come in, not just air tickets, but it's an endorsement. And I think well done to the team.
Absolutely. Ephraim?
I think for me it's in line with that, but it's on another side. So we had two huge events. One was, I think it was true to the popular saying, work hard, play hard. So we had a really huge, successful business forum. But let's also not forget the entertainment spectacle that happened over the weekend with Burna Boy.
Yes.
I think we have talked about this on The Square, about Kigali's nightlife in relation to Visit Rwanda. And an interesting fact, a lot of people flew in for that concert. And it was also good to see Visit Rwanda behind it as well. So
What
I
was
think
different? What was different?
about this event,
Yeah.
I think it was, not that I know the organizers, but I think it was organized by people who understood what needs to go, and at least they've been exposed to what international concerts look like, and it was really well organized.
It was fantastic.
It was really,
I personally don't attend concerts. I'm not all those people, but this was fantastic.
Yeah.
Very well done. A fantastic choice of venue as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was really good.
yeah. So that was, I think for me, like it's good always to bring things to a close in full circle. And we've talked about the nightlife in Rwanda, around concert tourism and entertainment tourism, and it was good to see that in action this past weekend at Bernabeu.
Yeah, well done to the organizers.
That's
So, Mr. Kayonga, thank you for joining us. We're going to get into the conversation. We've been having a lot of tweets earlier on about this, and the general gist of this conversation is government is hand-holding private sector. For how long should this go on? So my first question to you, that will be followed by my resident panelists, is on government divestiture. So basically government pulling out of private enterprises they have invested in. And we know that over the last two decades, government has made numerous investments in enterprises in the private sector as a first mover in jump-starting the economy. At the moment, we're seeing a series of divestments from government across different sectors, such as banking as well as agribusiness, amongst others. So is this trend because government investments have paid off and the companies they invested in can now operate independently? What is the reason behind this sort of trend in divestment?
Thank you very much. Once again, thanks for having us. I think to understand why government divests, one should first understand why government invests in the first place. Right from post-colonial times to the recent times, government has always recognized that there are certain investments that need to be done. And if you wait for other people to do it, it will be very difficult. And it was important that government moves in to do certain investments. Mainly investments that are within provision of certain goods and services, but also creating jobs. So I would say government invests for three purposes. One is wealth generation. Two, it's about providing a certain public good or service. And thirdly, it's probably a combination of both. Now, when you go into why government divests, it's also a combination of several factors. And if you look at our history, it is also important that one looks at how to promote the private sector. And you look at maybe 4 or 5 areas why government would divest. One is to strengthen the private sector by giving them opportunities, because most private sector operators are not interested in venture capital, where venture capital is new businesses. They would rather have businesses that are moving into the growth segment. Secondly, it's about also creating value. At times when you divest, where divest in this case means not selling off your whole stake, then you probably create value because you bring in a strategic partner who understands business better than you and then grows the business, and that leads to a greater value at a certain point in time. Another reason in the case of Rwanda was also to grow on capital markets. It was important that government was walking the tone, and that's why the first stocks that were put on the capital markets were governments, and they were quite a success. In the case of Bralirwa, we all know that government actually took a big discount so that there would be an incentive for private sector. And then lastly, it's because government recognizes that they could play a better role if they were regulating business and providing an enabling environment rather than being in the private sector itself.
Interesting. Before I go to my next question, do you have some comments you'd like to share, basically based on his reasons on divestiture?
I think I'd want to come in and talk about a bit of context. This conversation brings multiple aspects to it, right? Like you said, why did government invest in the first? Why does government invest in the first place? Why does government exit in the first place? But I think the most critical aspect of this conversation is what is the process of all of that, from the time government invests to divest. So I think I would want to talk about when government tries to get out of an investment, and I'll talk about it from the side of privatization. There's a report done by the Auditor General, and he went to look at.
You're referring to the 2016.
It was a 2016 report, and it detailed the privatization strategy of government from 1997 up until 2015. And he basically goes back to the point when the privatization secretariat was set up under Minekofin. And then later after, in 2008, when it was shifted to RDB and under the Strategic Investment Department. Now, what he highlighted was a serious problem with the privatization process that government went through. He highlighted certain things like, for example, when the way the contracts were set up, government in some cases would repossess these investments back from investors when investors would not implement the investment plan a certain way, and government end up losing in that case. And even the report shows just even simple things like the value they attach to some of these assets. How do you arrive at them? Then even the monitoring and even just the due diligence around whether these investors who are coming in are actually credible and do they have the capacity to actually grow these. And these are across agribusiness, general industry. There's a fishery that is mentioned. There's rice as well. We know Simergwa as well. Now, these are things that when you sit down and you look at it and you say, okay, what are the major... We talk of privatization, and government is working on this agenda to strengthen the private sector, capital markets, etc., etc. Do we necessarily have the right structures and frameworks to ensure that when that happens, these businesses are not dying? Because again, if government comes in and says, we're doing this to strengthen our economy and and create a certain level of, even the first movers aspect to it, but then you give it over to a private sector player and within a year or two it's down, that's counterintuitive. So the question then comes in is, this process in which privatization happens, is it necessarily the most efficient?
What do you have to say to that, Jack?
Interesting concept. Well, first of all, I don't think this is specific to government. Even pure private businesses do go into challenges. Even pure private businesses do try to go into joint ventures that go bad. So it is true that there have been some transactions that have gone bad, but I don't necessarily think it is because of the way privatization is handled. For sure, yes, it has been a learning curve. But I actually come also from the school of thought that, yes, there should be a provision for government to withdraw in case you do not live to the expectations. Because in any privatization deal, you have the technical and the financial. So you commit to do certain things. So as a government, the price in most cases is not the number one factor. It's the provision of that service or that good in a better way, in an affordable way, better than what government was doing. So if you don't do it, then it is right for government to take back the property. I know, without specifying a name, of a hotel and a tea factory that was withdrawn by government, and today they are doing very well. On another note, yes, it's a learning curve. But it would also be wrong for us to look at privatization in isolation, because one of the things that privatization brought to this country was also liberalization. Those who were there then know that when government started talking of privatizing, certain issues like liberalizing the economy was important. For example, forex liberalization, price liberalization. And then you even went to an extra stage of business reforms. Most of these things, I dare to say, would not have been achieved if privatization was not at the heart of the problem.
Dana, just before we go to privatization, let's take a step back and say, in the first case, before there's a necessity to privatize, it means it belongs to public. And the question really is how the government invests. And that's where I particularly have a bone of contention. In terms of the studies, the viability, the feasibility of some of these projects and how it's done, I'm a very strong believer. I can appreciate purely private ventures that are very close to infrastructure. Let me give an example of an airline or the convention center or building an airport or private roads that go into neighborhoods. You know, there's not too many private people who'd be excited about that. But when you invest hundreds of millions of francs or billions in cassava plant or a starch plant or a potato chips plant or you know, you can give or a dairy something. You can give a million examples until the cows come home. Or you build hundreds of expensive homes that are not going to be bought. It's one then asks the question around the viability, the feasibility that has been done, and I think therein lies the major problem.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the manner in which...
Exactly.
I think also to add to that, because the investment strategy is developmental minded, and maybe Jack can talk about this because he was at the development bank. That kind of money goes in not necessarily expecting a return on investment.
Yes.
The agenda, obviously any money that goes in wants to come back with a profit, but the major point of somebody putting in money is for a particular development agenda. Now, what happens is that along the way, the people scramble for an exit plan and automatically switch and say, oh, we want to offload this and give it to the private sector. And coming back to what Charlie says, some of these things are not profitable. And it's not easy to transfer them over to the private sector because the initial framework when they were setting these investments up didn't accommodate that profitability.
The profit element, yeah.
Well, I'll look at it from another angle because government usually has two choices. Should we structure it as a public service or should we structure it as a private sector good or a public sector service? If it does not have a dimension of profitability, there is no need to structure it as a private company. If the government decides to invest in a private company, it is because this particular company should be able, at the end of the day, in its life cycle, to be able to turn around and have some profitability. So I don't think, and probably it's an issue of mentality, but the reason you do have companies companies registered, owned by government, and yet they could have had them as parastatals, is mainly because their good and service is just beyond being a public good and service, but it can actually also be profitable. And that's why, even to the point that Charles mentioned, privatization is important, because along the way, government realizes that probably would do better if we changed on our governance and had some more strategic investments within the business.
Bueno. I just wanted to sort of shift the discussion. I think there's no doubt that the government has to get involved and that privatization helps. But let's look at our strategy. We've been using the Vision 2020. And within Vision 2020, it was clear that there has to be a transition to a private sector-led economy. Now, we are at 2019.
Last lap.
How close are we to achieving that? In my view, we are far from that. And I think the problem is that, one, government needs help. Like, it's done all the heavy lifting to the extent that the private sector has taken it for granted, and it doesn't seem to realize that the economy is there and exists for the private sector. So most of the time, and perhaps because government has been in the driving seat for a very long time, the private sector is waiting for signals from government. Now, why there's a problem? Today, for most places where you see government trying to pull out, let's go back to the examples he gave, the listing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the listing on the stock exchange. Yeah. We had Beka, we had Blaira. Where is the private sector, like a private company, a Rwandan private company listing on the stock exchange? Why haven't we seen that?
Okay.
That's one. Why isn't that happening? Yet, I mean, I know for a fact that the Rwanda Stock Exchange, CMA, is doing a lot in terms of awareness, building capacity, but it's taking too long. They even went further and amended the laws to sort of create an environment that would enable even medium companies to be able to list. That is not happening. The question is why? So is it high time that we sort of relooked at the strategy? That is the other element. Three, my final point is, in most cases, in my view, because again, government has done the heavy lifting, they have done the hard infrastructure, as expected, electricity, water. We have investors, investors, who sit and look at what governments are doing. And these people will come in proposing to our government that they're going to change things because they know there's a strategy. But what actually happens, these people will come in, take advantage of our incentives, and before you know it, they're saying, oh, we are broke, we're heading out. And then it's not working. So is it high time that we relooked at this whole strategy?
If I can come in and
But just very quickly, so our guest doesn't lose the Brenna's question.
It's in line with what she says.
Okay.
I think, and I'm saying this at the defense of the private sector, because there's this expectation that, but private sector gets serious. Private sector, why aren't you doing this? Private sector, you need to understand, and this is an honest truth, the level at which our private sector is the same, the level at which our private sector is, or at least the lack of being at the appropriate level, is the same reason why government got involved in the first place. Now, the question should be, is the private sector at that point to jump in on these opportunities? And we're talking about local investors, right? Coming back to your last point about briefcase investors coming in. For me, frankly speaking, if we're to be honest with one another, if we are at a point where you're a trader and somebody says, give me a purchase, you want to procure some products, right? And somebody says, give me a purchase order, and you're like, oh yeah, just bring it and I'll give you money. Automatically, you know that there's something that's missing. And now when you come down to listing, when you list a company, you're not just going to say, oh, tomorrow, let me go raise money on the capital markets and put my company up for people to buy in. You have to have certain governance structures in place, which we simply don't have. If you're to go to RDB and take all the certificates from the registrar's office and look at the board structures of most of these companies, you realize that most of the entities registers don't have.
At the end of the day, those are excuses.
No, it's not
You're
about
listing
what I'm basically saying is that we have to call a spade, that we need to work on capacity building of the private sector before we say private sector take over. From 1997. My point, let me explain. My point is, you need to understand that when they put this vision of 2020 and they said private sector led economy, my question is, at what point did we actually accept that our private sector needs much more work than we actually want to admit? And that for me is the honest truth. We have a lot of, I'm saying this even as a private sector member, there's a lot of work I personally have to do before I am ready for some of the things that government expects from me.
But can I throw in one caution just before Jack comes in?
Yes, I introduce his train of thought.
I have a wild feeling that Jack is enjoying this argument. That is.
Jack, please come in.
I think let me go back to the basics, and this is a mistake that most people make. You need to distinguish between being an entrepreneur and private sector.
That's true. Government
being in the private sector doesn't mean it's not private sector. Most people talk about private sector as entrepreneurs. So when government said in our Vision 2020, when we were saying to be private sector led, we didn't say who in the private sector is going to lead it. So the argument should be, is our growth being led by the private sector? I would say yes. Is it being led by Rwandan entrepreneurs? I would say not as much. So the question is not about the private sector, because without doubt, you can't achieve the growth rates that we have without the private sector. But how the private sector is constituted is an issue that all of us should talk about, whether it's about capacity building, whether it's about venture capital, whether it's about private equity. That I agree with. The issue of having briefcase businesses, these are pure market imperfections. As long as you have market imperfections, you'll always have this kind of briefcase businesses. But as we go on, and it's important to also understand that it is also part of the ecosystem. Even in developed markets, you do have them. And I am yet to know of any country that does not have its government involved in the private sector. The issue should be at what rate. The issue should be, does the government investments in the private sector crowd out other private investments, but not necessarily who's doing the business in the private sector.
And if I may just take it on from there, if we look at the economy as it is at the moment, would you agree that government to a larger extent is sort of crowding out?
Absolutely not.
Why? Because let's look at the targets that we need.
Let's go let's go by sector or by business?
No, let's go by the specific targets that we need to achieve in terms of jobs, in terms of the different sectors. Are we on target?
Well, if I took the example of jobs, I think the number one employment is by the private sector, and I think the number one sector that employs most is cooperatives.
No, Brenna, you think it's government? Charles, yes, you have something to say.
Yeah. My issue is, Brenna threw a kind of a spanner in the works, and that may give a false impression that the yardstick for measuring how serious or unserious the private sector is the participation on the stock exchange. No, that's a very dangerous assumption, Brenna, because I'll take you to another level and say, when you look at the volume of taxes that is paid, it's all coming from the private sector. So it would be an extremely unfair comment to say that the private sector is sleeping just on the basis of their participation on the stock exchange and how many companies are listed and so forth. So that is my biggest point. But Jack,
I mean, if we look at the largest taxpayers, have we had any movement in
terms of the order on the list?
Yes, in terms of the order on the list, who is the highest? No. Have we had any movement?
No.
Have we had any changes?
And that is because...
We've definitely had changes from the bottom of the pyramid.
But that's what I'm saying.
Yes, exactly.
What you want to see is a bit of movement.
There is movement.
Well, I don't know, unless if you're talking about recent history.
Yes.
If you talk about the case of Rwanda, from the 1994 or at least up to 2010, you want to talk about Bralirwa.
Thank you.
But today, you have at least, over 100 large taxpayers that are in the region of about Bralirwa. You talk about SCOL, you talk about the telecos, you talk about the banks. So I say, yes, it has changed.
You see, the thing is...
Can we move to the next question?
The thing is, just one clarification, yes. We are not saying that there's no progress. I think that should be clear.
Yes.
There's progress. But is it fast enough for us to achieve our ambitions? I think not.
Our targets.
Yes.
So
I don't think so. I think it's below.
I agree.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say.
The urgency, absolutely, it's there. So, in a nutshell, the question for you is regarding what the Square resident panelists are saying regarding the private sector performance. Do you think that they can be responsible for largely contributing to Rwanda's economy without investments, multiple investments from the government? Are we ready? As a private sector.
Without the government as a private sector player.
To largely contribute to
largely
this country's,
so they can still be involved,
economy.
But in terms of the percentage, they are minority. They are there to prop up some of the...
Do they still need to be handheld by government? Let me put it frankly.
I think the government intervention in the private sector is a bit exaggerated. Because if you looked at the number of companies, and I got to know this from my recent interventions, you have just a handful of government companies, or government companies that government has interest in. Most of these companies are actually small companies, Rwandan entrepreneurs. When you look at the growth that we are enjoying today, whether you talk about education, health, all this is being done by the private sector. They are the best. And definitely, yes, I agree that the private sector is doing a good job. They can do better. But there always has to be where you start from. And privatization is also one other way of encouraging them, because we had situations pre-privatization whereby people had made some money from other businesses, but they didn't know where to invest their money. And it also was another way of having collective schemes. You know, the times of investments like RIG, how they came up, so that people could be able to come together and enjoy those benefits. Yes, I do believe the private sector has actually got what it takes to grow. And government should always be by their side. I don't think I would call it hand-holding, because if you talk to the private sector, and I'm talking to some of the participants
in the private sector.
I'll be surprised if you said you're being hand-held, especially around this time when you're paying
income tax.
No. So I'm not too sure about that. And like what Charles said, we have moved to a point where today our own government revenues are contributing about, 62-64% of our own budget. That money doesn't come from government. It comes from the private sector. So I think it is a time that we actually celebrated the private sector and looked at a way of developing it further.
Exactly.
I wanted to carry on the point on developing it further and saying, in terms of when to invest and when not to invest, I think government has done a fabulous job in as far as areas to do with infrastructure and the other areas that are not too attractive for the private sector. But in the same breath, they've done an appalling job in areas that they don't know how to.
Like
To participate, and I'll give
for
practical examples.
He wants to what?
You have to say real estate.
I mean, real estate is probably not the best example to give because, you know, we might need towels to wipe our tears in this show. But other areas around manufacturing, for example, I was told of, I am aware of, I just mentioned it in passing earlier on, of a starch plant, I think in the Western Province. Hundreds of millions were spent and it's just there, lying idle. I've been told of rice plants that are set up and growers or outgrowers are not mobilized and the plants sit there idle. Same applies to milk stories that you hear of in newspapers and read of in newspapers of where milk is poured.
And these are entities that government invested in.
Yes. So there, in as far as those, and yet those are areas where they are actually private players who do well.
Yeah.
So my point is, let government pull out entirely from areas where they are where they don't know, where there are private people who do well, and let it concentrate on where they do well. Yes. So it pains today. And when I was walking into the studio, I was reading, I was watching the Kenya-Rwanda news, and there's in excess of 200 billion francs that the government of Rwanda has spent as a result of floods and the recent disasters. And the news article the news story was pointing out to areas where government has not put in place the enabling environment, drainage and what have you, so that some of these disasters can be prevented. That is where government should be doing. Roads, drainage, dams, and all these other things, as opposed to wasting billions of taxpayers' money in areas that they don't know.
You know, exactly, and I want to
Yeah.
add to that. You know, you had mentioned that, because you had mentioned in reply to my statement around the development agenda, that government would not, in some cases they should have set up parastatals, but in most cases, when there is a hope for profit, they get involved. But let's give a simple example, Rwanda. And I do not know of, statistics show globally, when you rank sectors by profitability, financial services is one of the highest. At the bottom of the totem pole is airlines. Airlines have some of the worst performing, it's one of the worst performing sectors in terms of profitability. So government obviously has to step in, because a Rwandan investor, private investor, even an international investor coming and saying, we're going to set up an airline called Rwanda, and we're going to run it X to grow it and maintain this loss for a period of time. Only government can do that, and they had to use a private structure. Now, what happens is, let's say 10 years down the line, government is like, you know, let us divest from this business and give it over to a private player. It doesn't make any sense. No matter how, we all know this, and even if, in terms of the strategic agenda, and coming back to what he says, there is picking and choosing what government is good at, and there is picking and choosing what government is not. And again, also when you look at the strategicness of some of these sectors in the country, let's take energy production. That is something where government needs to be. It's an infrastructure project, you know. But when government comes and says, let's set up a cassava plant, that's private sector led. So what government should be focusing on, instead of saying let's put money into something, they should be looking at the policy framework to attract people to put money into some of those sectors and stick to the ones where they know, look, this is capital intensive. Private sector investor, to get private sector investors for this, it's a bit harder. Instead of sinking money into some of these projects that where private sector, it's easier to get a private sector to come in.
I'm totally in agreement with what you and Charles are saying. Very quickly, Brenna, before we...
Just to respond to the Rwanda issue,
Yes.
I think quite often people look at Rwanda in isolation of the other sectors, its linkages to the economy. If you look at what Rwanda has done for the other sectors in the economy, you could just say Rwanda is profitable because tourism, the conference tourism that we're talking about, the numbers, Rwanda has done all the heavy lifting.
as a facilitator.
Yes, it facilitates.
But I'm saying, if you look at Rwanda in relation to the tourism of the country, tourism revenue, so government as a shareholder largely benefits. If you take a private investor and put him in tourism, unless he owns all the hotels and the conference facilities and the resorts, as an individual shareholder of Rwanda, where is the profit?
No, can we? I know Jack wanted to weigh in on, especially on what Charles and Ephraim was saying. Government should focus on what it is, can do best, as opposed to.
Well, I would want to agree with them, but they are holding one assumption that is not correct. They are holding an assumption that government has got a lot of money and doesn't know how to use it.
Thank you.
I don't know of any project or any business that government has invested in without first asking themselves the question, is there anybody in the private sector who can do it? I know those consultations are done. I know that these businesses are presented to the private sector first, but in most cases, the private sector has shied away. And it is because of that that the government has had to dip in their little resources and invest in these projects.
But why does the private sector shy away? And coming back to what I was saying about the policy framework to attract them.
It is about risk perception.
I think our government probably considers themselves as magicians. I think that.
I think beyond that. I think beyond that. If we look at what drives private investment, one, the cost of doing business. Now, we've done a lot of work on competitiveness, but we know that we still have challenges in terms of the cost of doing business.
Especially industry.
So you will show the private sector an opportunity and say, invest here, but when they do the numbers, it doesn't add up.
Actually, there's even an aspect of trust, and I think we've talked about this in the past. I know a story of somebody in Rwamagana. They built a huge plant. Now, they had been told by the guys for EUDL, that you can build this, bring these types of machines, the nearby infrastructure, the transformers and all of that will handle the capacity of these machines. The person brought, and no. Now, there's this thing of the consultative meetings where the RDB, the chief facilitator of investment and the private sector in our country, when they go out to these provinces, they went to the Eastern Province. They sat down with these guys. Now, the same statement, private sector is not serious. Private sector is what? But there's a betrayal of trust. Because a private sector person, government went out and said, invest. We know this happened in the hospitality sector. Private sector were told, invest in hotels. And we talked about this, and somebody said, but private sector shouldn't be naive and just take what is given to them in these dossiers. And exactly that. Because past situations have shown that if government comes to you and says, invest in this sector, you tread with caution. You say, you do it first. Then after you do it first,
based on that betrayal of trust.
Exactly. Just to touch a bit on hospitality, I think for clarity, when they said invest in hospitality, they didn't give clarity on what kind of investment, tourist destination. Government.
Government.
Yes, because we had local private people investing in 2-star, 3-star, yet Rwanda is the high-end, tourism destination. So what we are seeing now, people took up very expensive loans, built some shady...
If you were to point fingers, where would they go?
They would go...
Both sides.
It's
both sides.
Both
sides.
That's both sides.
Let's go to a third question, and this is to do with the Agaciro Development Fund. And based on the, I think, recent article, officials revealed that it currently has a growth rate of Rwandan francs 3 billion in new contributions every year, while it also get annual revenues and returns on investment that are between 9 to 10%. My question for you, 9 to 10% in investments annually, is government recently decided to put management of its shares in nearly 30 companies under this particular fund. What was the reason behind this?
Thank you very much. One thing is the government of Rwanda structured the Agaciro Development Fund as its sovereign wealth fund.
Can you just break down what that means, a sovereign wealth fund?
Sovereign to mean government, wealth fund to mean that we are driven by generation of wealth.
Okay.
So we have one mandate, and that is pure wealth generation for future generations. And last year, in the wisdom of the government, in looking at different ways of reforming the way they do business, and based on best practices in other places, the likes of Malaysia, Singapore, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, they realized that those governments had removed the commercial assets from the government portfolio and given them to their sovereign wealth funds. And usually it is done for about 4 purposes. One is to consolidate the assets into one government entity. Two, we all know that government is not necessarily the best manager of private business. So it's better to put it in a private arm that should be able to manage it better, that understands portfolio management. Three is about leveraging the portfolio, because once you put the assets in one balance sheet, then you can leverage it several-fold and be able to do other businesses. And the fourth reason is that it also comes as a stabilization fund in case the government has problems. So it's an investment that the government does for future generations, but in certain cases, as the fund grows, they're able to now plow back the resources into supporting the budget, which fits perfectly with the vision of our leadership in getting aid-free. To put things into context, in our case of Agachiro Development Fund, about 26 companies have been transferred in phase 1, and we have finalized the legal part, and we're now doing the valuations. Before they were brought onto our books, we are at about 62 billion francs. And it is true we have been averaging between 9 and 10%, but most of our investments have been in lending to banks, lending into government securities, be it T-bills and T-bonds. Once we have brought the companies onto our books, there will be about 4 benefits. One is that our book value is going to increase. I would comfortably say at least 3-fold.
Are you listing?
I'll come back to that. Secondly, I'll say is that we will be able to benefit from the dividends. Thirdly, to talk about the listing, we shall also divest, and to depend on the shareholding in the different companies. But clearly, we will definitely be one of the main champions of supporting the capital market.
So you're not listing Agachiro Development Fund. You're gonna list the portfolio companies that you would have gotten from government.
Agachiro Development Fund as a sovereign wealth fund will always be owned 100% by government.
Yes.
Okay.
But we shall be doing different types of listings. We can do partial listings, we can do SPV listings, but this will be pure about the portfolio or a mixture of the portfolio.
Okay.
Diana, just briefly on the listing. I'm very passionate about listing.
Clearly, it's
yes.
evident.
Yes, because Charlie mentioned earlier that it takes a lot to list. There's no doubt about that. I agree with him. But if we're going to build sustainable businesses, strong businesses, we need them to be able to be open.
They need to be public companies.
Yes, they have to be on the stock exchange.
We need to go to a social media feed.
We need to build the Rwanda Stock Exchange indicator in a way that the index also helps us attract investment.
But you do know that historically, globally, that the life cycle of a business, a public business, is shorter than the life cycle of a private business. By listing and becoming a public entity, the kind of expectations shift. You become now a short-term focused company. Granted, Rwanda has a different market, but at the end of the day, the fundamental still is.
Ephraim, are you trying to suggest that we don't need to
build an index? We need to list. But I'm trying to say the argument that listing is beneficial to the life cycle of a business is not necessarily, or at least entirely true. We'd have to add a bit of context to that. And that's why I think it's important to know which sectors, the types of businesses, why is it being listed, the value of the company.
He came on the defensive.
It's a conversation for another day.
He's just on the defensive.
I would like to agree, but I'm also in the private sector, so I
get to the stock
I
exchange.
have two thoughts about that. But so our first tweet, we're going to go to a social media feed, and our first tweet is from Junior Sabena Mutabazi, who says that I believe that at the point of making an investment decision, government should also have an exit plan in place and known to the enterprise. The absence of an exit plan can perpetuate the enterprise to rely so much on government handouts at the expense of efficiency and ability to compete. Very interesting about an exit
I think
plan.
it's true.
Before we go to our next tweet, what do you think of that, Jack?
Well, I actually don't know of any business that doesn't have an exit plan, because it is a very clear provision of the shareholders agreement. So it's not an issue of having an exit plan. It's more of an issue of exiting when you have to exit.
Exactly. It's about implementation. Stuff happened along the investment cycle that changed the investment landscape. I think in context, we should always add context. And this is why I keep saying businesses don't operate in isolation. There's an ecosystem, and that ecosystem even involves government itself as a regulator and policymaker. And what normally ends up happening is that you find that that framework can change. And
I think we've talked about it in the square, our regulatory environment in Rwanda, that is, it fluctuates quite a lot. Our next tweet is from Collins Mwai. Collins says that probably the biggest task ahead is to review and improve the quality of management so that we can reduce the frequency of losses and get more value for public investments, reduce profit shifting by private investors. So the quality of management.
I want to talk about the quality of management a little bit, and one of the things that bothers me on that front is twofold. One is on the high turnover of the leaders of these government business enterprises. But secondly, related to that is around governance and board composition and board responsibility. I know we've had a chat around when it comes to the private sector, that is, boards are held responsible by the Companies Act, and you know, if a board decides to look on as a company goes down, they can be held responsible. But in these government business enterprises, where sometimes you see people are appointed onto boards so that there is a balance of that guy from that institution who has these skills and the other institution is not well represented, and you know, and the quality of the board then therefore is a bit of a very huge compromise. Sometimes even the CEO is asked, who would you like to be on your board?
Exactly. No, I think if I can add
that's really very pertinent to the point that Collins raised around the quality of management.
I'll get back to you, but just in the interest of time. Okay, just make
quickly.
it quick. Yes.
I think back to what Charlie says. Boards need to be boards in Rwanda, and I say this especially with public institutions. I say this from my own personal experience. The amount of power that's given to boards to be able to dictate the strategic direction of a company is absolutely paramount, and it goes without mention. We go and we're like, let's hit certain.
And that's just a miss on corporate governance.
Definitely.
Completely. Our next tweet is from Leonard Munga, and this is in response to your Rwanda debate, Berna and Ephraim. On the issue of strategic investments such as Fly Rwanda, it has and remains critical for Rwanda's connectivity to the world, in addition to being an enabler for many sectors, including tourism and exports, notwithstanding the heavy investments.
Yeah, I think that's a no-brainer.
Heavy investments. Our next tweet, but this is what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
About the Rwanda issue. I think we read this tweet already. We'll just have one more tweet before we... and lower the next tweet. I think we're having an issue with
technology.
Our technician, but our next tweet is from Romeo Ngabo, and Romeo says that the investors tend not to be motivated when they're not given the longest lease period of property ownership as per the law, and of course this will contribute negatively to the growth of the private sector.
So this is, I'll give you a simple example. He's talking about real estate, right? And I know we had a conversation about leasehold and freehold. So a bit of context for the viewers. It's government has a choice. When you get a land title or a property deed, you can either lease the land from government or fully own the asset in perpetuity. So this is forever. Now, what normally happens is somebody is going to build, let's say, a huge commercial building or a factory. And the idea is that you're gonna only own the land for 15 years, and then you can renew it, or in some cases you find. And so what he's saying is, in relation to the law, is that the law should provide for, I think, 30 years, if I'm not wrong. And you find that it's hard. You get to the table. Your expectation is from what you read, because you've done your due diligence before you come to Rwanda. You read and it says 30 years. You land on the table and guys like, we can't give you 30 years because of X, Y, and Z. We'll give you 15. Now, mind you, this person has made his plans and everything around that. So it obviously has a way of affecting
with investors. Our next tweet again is from Collins Mwai, and this answers the question we're talking about private sector. He says it's not yet time to divest, in his opinion. Government's investments are still needed to de-risk large-scale projects. Private sector capacity remains considerably weak. Returns on some sectors are too low for private sector value chain sustainability. Jack, what do you have to say to that?
Well, I think it cannot be a general comment for the whole economy. I agree with what he says, but it should be specific to areas that we have gained economies of scale. I don't think government should invest in 2- 3-star hotels. I don't think government should invest in other sectors that we have already shown that the private sector can do it, and government has already de-risked it. I agree they should be focused on de-risking other sectors. But back to the issue that was discussed on management. First of all, government businesses are governed by 2 laws. There are companies that are set up by an act of parliament, and there are companies that are set up through the Register General. So those that are set up under the act of parliament are the ones that you'll have managed by the ministries and the rest. But the ones that are set out under the company's law, these are entities. And Charles knows this better than I do, that the current company law really provides provisions for holding people accountable, right from the board and management. And I don't think the issue would be the weakness in the law or the weakness in the appointment. I think the issue should be about accountability and transparency in the whole appointment. And the beauty about most of these companies that government has invested in at the level of the Register General is that there are very few, at least to the best of my knowledge, that government has got absolute majority. So they are all governed and through a shareholders agreement. Then the issues of management again also come in about how you follow up. Yeah, it may be that, but the other issue is also holding one another accountable. And I think government moving further in its portfolio management and transferring it to a private entity like ours, one of the expectations is that we should be able to hold them accountable, because we shall be appointing the boards and we shall be supervising the management at shareholder level.
Let's read our last tweet for this evening, and the last tweet is from Richard. Richard states that privatization leads to greater efficiency and effectiveness in service delivery to the people. Privatized firms aim for profit and cost efficiencies, but that usually means lower level of service and job cuts, which affects the economy. I'm for government involvement to an extent. Interesting. We've come to the end of our show. I would like to give our guest a chance to give his closing remarks. Is there something you wanted to say, Brenna? Is it brief and to the point?
Yes, transparency.
Yes.
I think we need more transparency around government investment, because that helps with accountability. It's very difficult to hold people to account that you're not aware about, because most of the time we get to know about these deals after or when they've gone bad,
when they've gone south.
Yeah, so
mine is really not a comment, it's a question. I mean, Jack must be excited that he's signing on a lot of these companies. Which one are you most excited about? If you rank the top 3 that you're signing up.
I can't choose between my children.
Very smart. Very smart. That's a good one. I pray very quickly.
I think for me, the takeaway from this, at the end of the day, people have to play their roles. But for people to play their roles, they need to understand their roles. And I think the biggest question I think that can be raised from this is, to what extent have we taken the time to try to understand our roles? Both as entrepreneurs in the private sector, for clarity's sake, because you made it very clear, and as government in the private sector. And that's the only way we can not get in each other's way and actually grow the private sector in the way that we need to.
In a very complementarily
exactly.
way.
Well, I'll digress a bit and use this opportunity to thank all those who have been contributing to Agachiro Fund, but also to talk to everybody else that the journey is still ahead. We need to continue contributing to the fund. Government has shown its ability by investing in the fund significantly. Government gives us at least between 3 to 5 billion a year. It has transferred its projects. So from a government saving point of view, I think government is doing well. From the others, I would like to commend especially government officials, the public sector. They have continued to contribute. And contribution is really from the heart, because this is all about caring about the future generations. And I like to share the story of our military and the police and the Rwanda Correction Services. We all know how much they earn, and they are not in the brackets of the best paid in Rwanda. But I would tell you that those 3 institutions, in our annual contributions, they contribute more than 50% of the contributions. They contribute over 1 billion a year. So if the army, the police, and the Rwanda Correction Services can do it, all of us can do it. And it is our our noble responsibility to do it. So allow me to use this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Please list soon.
We'll do that. And once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for honoring our
you.
invitation. Yes, and I would like to echo in our quest for self-sufficiency to really contribute to the Agachiro Fund.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, Ephraim, Bernard, Charles. Always a pleasure. Interesting discussion. Please keep the conversation going using the hashtag #TheSquareRW on our Twitter feed. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. Have a good night. But before signing off, I'd like to thank our partners, Uzi Collection and Bourbon Coffee. Thank you and have a good night.